What were some of the thoughts in terms of how it should be viewed? Because I think that flows into this week.
I said something about how the Torah is more of a guidebook than mine. As the world is like a changeable.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Some people voice that myths can be very true.
Ooh,
Like, even though they're not history, they're more true than history. And some people are the belief that we should see it as historically true as well.
Hmm.
And that by being passed down by the oral tradition, there's things get maintained and preserved better than we might think.
interesting.
So is it like a telephone or
Yeah,
a game?
Sometimes it's preserved, sometimes it gets mixed up.
Interesting.
Just like, telephone, like, we tell someone something, and by the end of the line.
It's
Really
different.
different.
Yeah. And I think what belies that assumption is that the Torah isn't necessarily written by God, but by people. Right? Is kind of what underlies that. Interesting. Let me just make sure. Sharon, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, yes, very well, thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because otherwise the recording wouldn't work. Okay. Yeah, so it's interesting because it does, and we have the oral law versus the written law, which is going to be the focus of what this week is about, where we would have, some people might be sitting saying that every word of Torah, every word that was written down in the Torah was written by God, or at least written by God, or at least revealed by God and written concurrently by Moses. And then, and that's a very different way a different perspective than it's a tradition that's been handed down that was later written down, right? That's very different.
But it only went to a certain period of time and didn't go beyond.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And when we talk about our connection to it, because as you read through as you get into the Rabbinic and the medieval period next week, but as you look at the Rabbinic and the medieval periods, what's interesting about them is that we know that now it's the rabbis looking at the law and writing it down and interpreting it and figuring out what it had to say. But certainly during the Rabbinic times, the assumption is that it's the word of God. Even to the extent that you have somebody like Rashi, which you'll talk a lot more about Rashi next week, so I'm not going to go deep into Rashi, but Rashi believed that every single word of the Torah was from God, so every single word had to make sense. So for example, if a word is repeated twice, there has to be a reason why that was repeated. So it's a very different question, or different, different perspective, when you believe that when you take it as a given that the words of the written tradition of the Torah and the Hebrew Bible are straight, as we would say. I don't know if you talk about this with Rabbi Brian, min hashamayim, straight from God or from heaven, versus if we, and I'm not saying where I stand on all of that, but I'm just saying that sets an interesting stage for understanding Rabbinic Judaism, because we know very clearly, and I'm sure Rabbi Brian said, when was the period of biblical Judaism? When did that end? When was that codified? We have that basically, and certainly by the period of the destruction of the Second Temple in 70, you have a lot being kind of beginning to close with the destruction of the first temple. But certainly by the destruction of the second temple, you have, um,
Are any parked in the back lot? I am. Okay, Hannah doesn't have a spot, so I don't really notice it. I can move.
okay. Sorry. Usually you can park it behind Hillel in, yeah. So yeah, so anyways, when that period ended, what would you imagine would be, if we consider the complete, like, sort of end of that biblical period to be the destruction of the temple, second temple in 70 AD, what would you imagine, based on what you talked about last week, or just based on the readings, based on what you know, what would be one of the biggest questions that the rabbis had to answer during the rabbinic period?
How are
So-
you gonna remember all the stuff written down when it's all gone?
That's actually a wonderful question. That is not what I was thinking of, but it's probably a better issue than what I was thinking of. No, that's excellent, actually. That is not at all where my mind was. I love it. That was great.
Thanks.
Which commandments to follow?
Absolutely.
How do you follow them best?
Yeah. How do you follow them? Which ones to follow? And also, any more? And then I'm gonna kind of ask another question related to this.
It would like help to reorganize everything.
How do you organize it all? How do you reorganize it? What do you do with it? How do you know what to follow? How do you know what's true? What is the major covenant that God made with the Jewish people that the entire sort of biblical period rests on?
Abraham and
And what was the promise that God made to Abraham? You're absolutely right.
that he would like make, that they would have somewhere in the regardless where they were.
That I will be your God and you will be my people, and you will have the land of Israel that I will give to you as a symbol, as a physical symbol of the covenant, right? You're exactly right, Jackie. And that's the entire tradition in the biblical period was built around that promise. Because a lot of the biblical period you hear, you're not following, you hear the prophets railing against the people, you're not following the commandments, you're not doing what God told you to do. You aren't living your life the way that you should, you need to follow me. You have a lot of tension among the kings. I'm sure you talked about all of that last week. Now in the rabbinic period, the big question, what would be the big question that might rest upon the destruction of the temple and the people being exiled from the land of Israel?
What do we do next? What do we do? We don't have
What do
our
we
land.
do? Absolutely. We don't have the land. And part of that is, what did we do? Did God break the covenant?
We messed up
Did-
something.
Exactly. Did we mess up? Right? That's a big question that would come about, because if the land of Israel is the physical symbol of that promise, along with the Torah and tradition and everything that biblical Judaism rested upon, and we can talk more about that because all of that has to change as well. We'll go there in a second. The question of that is sort of pervasive during this period, at least on a unwritten sense, is what do we do now, but also why would God take the land away from us? Why would we be exiled from the land? Is it that the covenant doesn't exist anymore? Is it that we made a mistake and we want to get back there? What would be sort of the, and what does that, give me some thoughts on that.
They're kind of like, what do we do wrong? What do we mess up? How do we make this right and have a covenant?
Absolutely. And much of the rabbinic Judaism is focused on actually the questions that you brought up. One is, what did we do? How do we repair it? How do we get back into the land? Everything from that time period forward, the central focus is returning to the land of Israel, a central focus. And the other is, how do we live our lives now as a Jewish community? And also, how do we live our lives in such a way that we're no longer going to anger God, right? And so much of rabbinic Judaism are rabbis trying to figure out the answers to all those questions.
It's a very difficult question.
Absolutely. Yeah, say more.
Well, I don't know, it's just a very difficult question because you don't know. You don't have a leader. How do you know, so
And who will be our leader,
That's
which is
the
the
whole
other
thing, yeah.
huge question, because
you
if,
need a leader.
yeah,
not just-
well, and during the biblical period, so much of it was focused, who were our leaders during the biblical period? There were two major sets of leaders, and who were they? Does anybody, I don't know if you talked about that last week. So you had
David,
the kings, exactly. You had all the kings.
Moses,
You had Moses, you had Moses and later the prophets. And you had,
I remember the Levites and the Israelites.
and the priests, exactly, the priests, exactly. It's exactly right.
Like, they were up here, they were up here, and they're fighting each other. Like,
Absolutely. And all
well,
of
they were
those,
like, not like like fighting each other. Like, how do we make
Well-
peace with each other?
well, and
So when
very
did
much,
Judah come back?
what?
When did Judah come in?
So you had the 12 tribes
Yeah.
that were Joseph's sons and grandsons.
Okay.
And those 12 tribes settled in the land. And you had Judah and a little bit of Benjamin,
Okay.
who were who basically is what we have left of Jews today. And then you had the other tribes that were essentially wiped out by Assyria when they came in much earlier than the destruction of the first temple. And then later, and then you had sort of, and that was I don't know if you talked last week about the split of the kingdoms, how you had who were our kings? I'll ask that better. Who was our first king?
So
Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. And after Solomon, he made so many, and this is all biblical, but it's important to understand rabbinic.
Yeah,
You need that sort of,
very-
and so after Solomon is when things really, Solomon married a lot of foreign wives. He married a lot of women, and he had a lot of sons and that were fighting each other. And, you know, both David and Solomon did some very questionable things. And after Solomon, you have the split of the two kingdoms. You have what I just said, Judah and a little bit of Benjamin, and the other tribes and a little bit of Benjamin. Eventually, so you had the northern kingdom, and then Judah and Benjamin. They essentially, Judah and Benjamin maintained, the others were wiped away by Assyria. And so you have what becomes the Judaism of
Right.
today is Judah and a little bit of Benjamin. But they didn't have it so well either, because you had then exactly, I think you said, Jackie, oh no, who said the prophets? Moses, you said Moses and the prophets, who were, you hear in the whole book of prophets about how the people weren't following God's ways, and they were marrying foreign wives, and they were not taking care of each other, and they were letting people starve, and they were abusing, not taking care of the widow and the children, and not following God's ways. So you had them, you still had the kings who were pretty corrupt, the line following down from Solomon. And then on top of it, what Jackie said is you had the priests started to develop as their own class. So you had three real branches of power, kind of like what we have in the US, three branches of power. And there was a lot of tension between them as to who was going to determine. You had the priests that you needed for the sacrificial system, which isn't going to continue in the rabbinic period. You had the rabbis who once the first temple fell, a lot of the intelligentsia was carried away to Babylonia. Tell me if I'm going too fast or if you didn't cover any of this last week or you need, but you had a lot of the intelligentsia carried away. They became scholars with their seat of wisdom sort of being in Babylonia, Pompeii academies there. And then you still had you still had some of the prophets still sticking around in the land, some that got carried off. Pretty much most of them got carried off with the destruction of the first temple. And then the Jews regained the land. The second temple's built, sort of. I mean, you had a huge, heavy Roman influence at that point, and a lot of corrupt Roman leaders. But anyway, then with the destruction of the second temple, sacrifice ended. So what was the role of the priests? Would they go on to lead? Would it be the rabbis who had been essentially their seat of power? You did have some in Jerusalem as well, but the seat of power there was in Babylonia. Or pretty much the prophets were gone by them, so they were kind of out of the picture. But what shapes the Jewish future with the close of the second temple period, the close of the period with the destruction of the second temple, the close of that period was essentially a power struggle between the priests, which were the Sadducees, and the rabbis, which were the Pharisees. And the Pharisees essentially won out. And what we have today is what's based on what we call Pharisaic Judaism, or the rule of the Pharisees or the rabbis.
Approximately, can you put an approximate date on it?
So 70 was when the temple was destroyed. 70 CE or AD we would call it CE, the common era, but otherwise AD. And that's when that era, I mean, obviously it didn't close like, it's closed, but that's sort of when the height of that sort of,
The Pharisees went over the Sadducees.
they went out over the Sadducees and
Around
basically,
70?
well, by 100, 200, it's not going to, it didn't happen in one day. It was sort of a power struggle that was going on. But what became the next layer of Jewish tradition was the Mishnah, which was a code of law where the rabbis, meaning the rabbis as scholars, not rabbis. When we say rabbis, we aren't talking about a rabbi like I am today, where I officiated things and all of that. We're talking about rabbis as scholars sitting around studying the Torah and studying law and trying to figure out how people should live their lives. Almost like teachers, exactly. And actually, rabbi means teacher, my teacher.
Can you say a couple more things about the Sadducees, how their version
So,
of Judaism was maybe different?
well, so they were primarily the priests, and so Kohanim, and they were pretty much focused in animal sacrifice because that's what they did. You could not, so when you wanted to make an offering to God during the biblical period, the only way to do that, depending on which time period, was either to go to your local higher ground and offer up your sacrifice through the priest, or to come to the temple. And the priests were very focused in temple worship. Temple meaning, again, not meaning like what we have Beth Shalom down the street, meaning the holy temple in Jerusalem, and that being the place for the priests. And they completely controlled that temple with the Kohanim, with the Levites, I mean, and but like when I don't know if you, like at high holiday services on Yom Kippur, when it talks about how the priests went to the Holy of Holies and would offer the sacred ineffable name of God, and it would only be uttered once a year, and everybody had to pray for the priest, and they would sacrifice the goat. They would have two goats, and one would be slaughtered and one would be sent off into the wilderness. That was essentially that role of the priests of being the arbitrator, so to speak, of sacrifice, and that almost not quite, but that relationship between the people and God.
But like, what was their argument? Like, so the temple is gone, they can't make any sacrifices. What's their argument? So if they're disagreeing with the Pharisees, what's their argument for
To
them
stay?
Yeah,
That's a great question. Essentially, they want to turn into more of like a priest-like structure of like taking of kind of ruling the people, but they didn't have much of an argument, which is why they fell
just want to
apart.
be in charge.
Yeah, pretty much.
They didn't have something.
They didn't
over
have,
the
now what
Pharisees.
the Pharisees had been doing since the temple had been destroyed the first time, you had a huge seats of, huge academies of where the Pharisees, the rabbis were studying and looking at Jewish law and were already struggling with some of these questions and issues. So, so that's kind of the, I don't know if I want to say reason, that's kind of not the right word, but that's sort of why it was the natural transition into the Pharisees as becoming the leaders, although it wasn't necessarily an easy transition because people, you had those that, you certainly had the priests who'd had a lot of power, still not complete power because you had the Pharisees also at that, you had the roots of who the Pharisees were already starting to look at Jewish law and shape Jewish law. But what the Pharisees were doing was taking the written law, the Torah, and trying to interpret it for their time. Now, a question I would ask, what?
I guess it was corrupt.
Could have been a bit corrupt, probably, no different than today, right? So the first layer of tradition, as I mentioned, was the Mishnah, which was codified around 200 by Yehuda Hanasias, who codified it, but was basically the writings of the rabbis who would look at a law and try to figure out what its implications were, essentially. So you might have the law of like, okay, you should pray to the you should pray and you should pray. Let's say, I mean, I'm being a little bit simplistic, but you should pray. Well, it doesn't really tell you how, especially when you're not sacrificing. Not that prayer is the direct replacement of sacrifice, but you're not offering up sacrifices anymore. What do you do to pray? When should you pray? How should you pray? How many times a day should you pray? What should you do when you pray? How do you approach God when you pray? What should be your intention when you pray? What if you don't have complete intention? Should you pray or should you not pray? And that word is called kavanah. Should you have complete kavanah? Should you not? So there were every single question about how to live their lives were things that the rabbis started to look at because they wanted to understand how to do it. And why do you think what might have been their impetus for wanting to figure out exactly the right way to do it?
Because they don't want to screw up the covenant again.
Exactly. So a lot for them, a lot is sort of metaphorically lying on it. Because they want to make sure they're doing what God wants them to do. But at the same time, what else do you think they had to prove? If we've got this, is it going to be the Pharisees or Sadducees rule? What else do you think they have to prove? Why they're right. The Pharisees have to prove, why the Sadducees are wrong. Yes. And conversely, why they're right. So they have to root their authority in something.
I was kind of curious about like what skepticism were they met with, and was there how long was the
Sort of the transition?
period of establishment?
I would say from about the time of the destruction of the temple through the codifying of the Mishnah, although certainly by the time that was codified, it was sort of pretty clear the Sadducees had died out and the Pharisees became sort of where Judaism went for a variety of different reasons, but some of which were, it made sense and it was practical, but also they were really trying to figure out how people could live their lives and what their laws would be. And remember, what's the difference? I'm going to ask that as a question. What's the biggest difference between that time period in like the time period where we're living in today, where we have American law. So we have laws of how to govern our lives, even if we aren't part of a religious community,
Yeah, but
right?
how long did that period last before there was a transition?
The Pharisees, you mean?
Yeah,
So rabbinic Judaism stays around, I mean, the period closes around 600 or 700
Yeah.
and we move into the medieval period, but the rabbis in Pharisaic Judaism is what continues out of it. So you first had the Mishnah, which was, codified, was rabbis' discussions and arguments and decisions of how to live life. But they were not just what we would think of today as religious law, because civil law and religious law, they're living as a community of people. And you don't have a sort of an outside government governing them in the same kind of way as what we know today.
They don't have separation of everything like they do now.
Mhm. So when they're looking at Mishnah, not only are they looking at like, how do you pray every day? And what time should you say the Shema? And how should a woman behave? And how should a man behave? And all of that. But they're also looking at things like if a person is in the middle of their prayers and somebody comes and they're a shop owner and somebody comes into the shop and wants to buy something, but you need to be focused. You need to have kavanah, intention during your prayer. Then what do? Do you stop in the middle, or do you have to, and let's say the person says, comes to you and says, I want to buy this for $10, and you're in the middle of your prayers, so you can't answer. And eventually the person says, well, I'll give you 20 for it. I'll give you 30. I'll give you 40. Do you have to take the first $10 that they offered? Because you can't have your prayers be the reason that you cheated somebody out of money. So like they're focusing on, and what happens if there's a garment laying on the ground and I grab it and you grab it at the same time? Who does it belong to? So they're looking at issues of day-to-day, what we would call day-to-day life in law, as well as the larger religious law. And all of those are questions that are being struggled with and asked and in rabbinic tradition. And then in addition to that, after the Mishnah is codified, they weren't done because there were still more questions that arose. And so the Talmud arose after that, which was codified around 600. And the way that the Talmud reads, I don't know if anybody's ever seen what the Talmud is or what anybody, it's a book. Well, we see it as a book. It's not what it was, but it's got the law in the middle. Let me see if I can pull up a page actually, because I think it's important to see what it looks like. That's a good one. Okay, so that's not a good one. It's not big enough. Ooh, sorry. That's a little bit better. Okay. So here's a page of Talmud. And if you can see in the middle here, that's going to be Mishnah and Gemara. So you're going to find in here one tiny little Mishnah here. And that's like one, not what it says, but let's pretend for ease of it. It says, on every morning you should get up and you should pray. But you can only say the Shema until 10 o'clock in the morning. I mean, that's not what it says. I'm just making something up. Then it will go on all here and on the next page and the next page and the next page and the next page with discussing that one idea. Except the discussions are not like you and I sitting in this room and discussing. It's oftentimes conversations between rabbis of a number of generations. So you won't know that from reading it. You have to know enough to know that. And it's not written like it's not going to be like, well, I think you should read it. I think that by 9 o'clock you should stop reading because you really shouldn't pray after 9 o'clock because the sun is out there all the time. And then you looking at me and saying, well, actually, my grandfather used to pray, my grandfather used to pray up until 10 o'clock, so I think it's okay to do the prayers. What's actually happening is it's over those conversations over a variety of generations. And over a variety of rabbis who may or may not have ever been in the same room. And then around here, you have another layer of conversations from rabbis who are discussing what's in here.
Okay.
And then after that, you have layers of conversation. So the further out from the center column that you go, the more current those discussions are. So you'll have oftentimes even medieval commentators out here. That makes sense. Maybe you don't see that.
Lots of discussion questions in it.
What?
Lots of discussion.
Lots of discussions and questions in it, tons and tons, absolutely. But what's interesting, we call all of this oral law, even though it's written down. Now, the question is, well, what might be, I'll ask you this, what might be some of the questions that the rabbis are going to have to address besides how to live your life? If people might be questioning their authority.
Why do we think that? Why is that?
Mhm. How do I root my authority? How do I make you believe that I'm the authoritative one who can say this? Do I root it in Torah text? Do I, and this switches all over the time. By the way, there's not one answer to this. This is a variety of answers. Sometimes it's, well, I can root this in Deoraita, which means the laws of the Torah. So I can tell, not really, I'm giving an example, but this isn't really a real thing. But I can tell you, my example is that in the Torah, it says you have to say the Shema when there is still light in the sky, whatever, it doesn't really. But they might use that and say, and then quote that Deoraita, that verse straight from Torah, or they might say, which they've done in some cases, essentially, one of the most interesting, again, I'm gonna paraphrase this a lot, but one of the most interesting texts in the Talmud is where people say, where the rabbis are essentially saying, somebody asks, how did you even get that idea? How did you get that law? How did you get that idea? And they said, well, you know what? Moses was sitting in an academy once, which Moses never sat in an academy. Moses was out in the wilderness wandering. And he sat down and he was like, I don't understand any of this. I don't get this. I don't know what's being said. This doesn't make any sense. And then the rabbi said, but it was drawn back to Moses Rabbeinu, Moses, our rabbi. And Moses said, oh, that's right. You're right. It's okay. And so the rabbis are saying, oh, we have the right to kind of interpret tradition, but they would never say, we would call it interpreting tradition. They would say they're completely rooted in Torah and in Jewish law and in God's, because remember, again, this is God's word to them, and they're completely rooted in God's word. And you had both Mishnah and Talmud with a lot of halakha. This is really the period where halakha or Jewish law develops. And you had a lot of halakha that's rooted in Torah, rooted in what the rabbis decided Torah said. And you also had a lot of what we would call stories or midrash embedded in there that explained things from more of a point of view of a story. And then you also had other types of midrash where the rabbis are looking at different, like looking at the Torah and just trying to interpret it. Like they might look at it and they might say, let me think of an easy one. Okay, so you have one where the rabbis say, one of my more favorite ones is that, the rabbis start talking about the evil, the good and the bad inclination. And they say that they can find that in Torah because, God said that it was very good. And the rabbis ask, well, how could God say that people are very good? Well, because they have both the good and the bad inclination, and it's really up to what they do. But how is the bad inclination very good? Because if it weren't for the bad inclination, then a person wouldn't get married, wouldn't have children, wouldn't have a family, wouldn't have a job. And they say, because if you only had the good inclination, then you would, then all you'd want to do is study Torah all day, basically, and you wouldn't go out in the world and use Torah and use your, and, and live your life. So even the bad inclination is good when you channel it properly. So that last one is an example of a midrash, of a story that kind of teaches you something and teaches you how to live your life, but also teaches you how to look at what's happening in the world around you.
It's like everyone has to be good or bad, basically.
Mhm.
I mean, you said it's not important.
Exactly. Nothing is inherently bad or good. And that's a very strong Jewish principle. It's just what you do with it and how you use it. So, yeah. And you'll see within the midst of all of this, a lot of agreements, disagreements, etc. So, yeah. Other questions, thoughts?
Do you ever think about older ways of doing Judaism? And think about, did they have it a way that more in tune for you?
It's a great question.
Because this is sort of like opening up a new door.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually interesting because I think that, I mean, some traditions do get brought back from either rabbinic period, even medieval period, that even sometimes like for a number of years, people may not have done certain ceremonies and then they come back. Like one that I think has been revived on a more popular level is something like Tu B'Shvat, which is the birthday of the trees, celebration of the environment. Recently, it's become popular to have a Tu B'Shvat Seder, which hadn't really been done for a lot of years, really, but somebody kind of found that it was a mystical tradition, and they brought that back. So that's
I guess it. Yeah, sorry.
oh, that's okay. Yeah, but that is, so it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Without a temple and the animal sacrifices, is Judaism seen somehow as diminished?
so there are those who would say that it is, but it's interesting because others found other ways about that, which would have been lots of different local communities that would have their own local ways of praying and saying the Shema and the Baruch Hu, and the whole system of prayer developed, and that was something that was much more communally based, and the idea eventually of minyan developed, that you had to have 10 men to say certain prayers. That started to develop, and so there were other ways that people looked at to structure community, because certainly the idea of having community was very, very strong once we were exiled.
It's like it's us against the world kind of deal.
Yeah.
What happened to the, but.
It's like we only got each other and it's us against the world kind of deal.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but what happened to during the destruction of the temple, what happened to all the rabbis? Were they
Well-
destroyed as well?
Some were and others many had already stayed in Babylonia and
Oh,
never
okay.
came back. And then there was also, there's always been a Jewish presence in Jerusalem
Okay.
and in Israel. So there actually are two parallel Talmuds. There's the Yerushalmi, which was based in, with its seat being in Jerusalem, and Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, with its seat being in Babylonia. So there's actually always been some sort of a mostly rabbinic presence in Jerusalem, that weren't exiled, so to speak, that never left.
Are there any pockets of modern Judaism that are rejected?
You know, that's a really interesting question.
Rabbinic?
Yes. Yes, there were actually, they ended up, that's, so one community, which may or may not have been Jewish, would have been the Essenes, and I don't know if anybody's heard of that, the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were probably a Jewish sect. They were celibate, so they didn't marry. They adopted children. They have eventually disappeared.
It's more likely those who rejected by the greater
Jewish community as well. And then you had the Sadducees, who continued to sort of try to be there. They ended up pretty much disappearing as well because of their interpretations of what Judaism was. It just didn't fit with where Judaism went. So they kind of disappeared and I would say sort of died off as well. Exactly. Well, probably not. Now, the closest thing that you might have, but I think it's different than what you're saying, would be the Ethiopian Jews, which were a later tribe of a tribe of Judaism that was discovered, who only had biblical Judaism, living in Ethiopia, and there were actually, and they're Black Jews, and they were rediscovered. They had always been based on like the dream was to get to Jerusalem. And no, they were not sacrificing because there was no temple for them to sacrifice at. And it's actually interesting. They're in they either died or came across the desert in Operation Moses, which was in, let me just get you a date. That was in the 1980s. There was a huge civil war in Sudan, and the Ethiopian Jews, many of them some were airlifted and some crossed the entire desert to get to Israel, because that's the dream of the Ethiopian Jews but they followed a biblical Judaism because they didn't have any, and that wasn't a rejection of rabbinic Judaism. It was just what they had, that was all they had. They never made it. Yeah. And there in Israel, it was a little bit of an issue when they came because of that, but they were eventually accepted as Jewish, and they live in Israel, and there's oh yeah, this just happened in 1980s. But they have more adopted Pharisaic Judaism. I mean, we don't call it that now. They've adopted what we would consider Judaism today, rabbinic Judaism, or where Judaism has gone today. But it's really, if you ever go to Israel, it's a very interesting community to visit. We were just there this last summer. When I was there in August, we actually had a really great conversation with I met Ethiopian Jews before, but we actually had gone with a group of students and met a number of the older women who had come across from Ethiopia and heard about their struggle and what that was like for them to be integrated into Israeli society, and actually some of the struggles that they still face in Israeli society, because it's a huge culture clash. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, there is. Yeah, look up Ethiopian Jews. It's Operation Moses. It's all really interesting. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of like when they with the Soviet model in the country and all that, my, like, the adopting children overseas.
Yeah,
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. no, it's true.
Sorry.
No, that's nothing to be sorry for. That's great. All right. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
That's maybe.
Yeah. All right. And the